John Swingle leaves John Howell Books in 1960 and opens the Alta California Bookstore in Berkeley. John soon takes a place in the creative school of antiquarian bookselling, for which Bill Reedon had become so well known. He specializes in ephemera and building collections on what were considered esoteric and unconsidered esoteric subjects. He does, for example, a catalog on African Americana in the early 1960s. He moves from one location to another, and finally, in the late 70s, to Laguna Beach, and retires from the book trade. Here are some of his catalogs, photographed. Long for doing these kinds of things. California Resorts, that was actually after he moved. This was a building that John put up on Shattuck Avenue specifically for Alta California Books. It's still there. They moved out of it a few years later. In 1961, this is a catalog that David McGee issued called A Course in Correct Cataloging, which is a satire on terrible cataloging. David McGee was still having a good time. In 1961, Morris Moskowitz, or Mo as he would become known, opens the paperback bookshop at 1984 Shattuck Avenue in Berkeley. This would later become Mo's, now a famous bookstore on Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley. Here's the announcement for the first ABA Book Fair held at the St. Francis Hotel, printed by Lawton Kennedy. In 1963, Peter Howard goes into business as Serendipity Books, working out of his home in Berkeley. 5 years later, Serendipity rents premises on Shattuck Avenue in Berkeley, and then adds space and increasingly more space. By the late 1970s, Serendipity had fully lived up to its name and was clearly unlike anything the antiquarian book trade had seen before. For collectors, booksellers, librarians, book scouts, poets, small press publishers, printers, and many others, it was a destination. With multiple layers and dimensions, there was something in its convoluted order for almost anyone with bibliophilic interest, and the patience and fortitude to find it. Patience and fortitude were also occasionally required in negotiating the temperamental nature of Peter and his staff, which at times seemed as complicated as the physical order of the store itself. Serendipity becomes one of the best-known antiquarian bookstores in California. Of course, Serendipity recently closed, but Peter left with us several book people who worked there: Jack Shoemaker of Sandollar Books, North Point Press, and now Counterpoint Press. Tom Goldwasser, who's here with us this evening, was there, and previously at Holmes, Burton Weiss, and yours truly. There's Peter's first catalog. There's David McGee's moving card when he left 442 Post Street to move out to Fillmore Street. Now Bill Reedon's moving in, so he says, a country bookseller arrives amidst the metropolitan madness. You got a nice moving out card and a nice moving in card. In 1967, with New Begins on its, there's Reedon's, one of his first business cards. In 1967, with New Begins on its last legs, the manager of his rare bookstore, John Scopazzi, leaves and goes into business for himself, first in the Fitzhugh Building on Union Square, and then at 278 Post Street. In 1967, there's the iLab Congress in San Francisco, and Bill Reedon does an iLab poster, and Bo is here. We'll have to get him to explain this after the talk. Paul Elder's final location in the Mills Building, 1968, closes. In 1970, Bernard M. Rosenthal of New York City moves his antiquarian book business to 251 Post Street and becomes a beloved fixture in the Bay Area antiquarian book scene, which he still actively participates. Here's a photograph of Barney removing the sign from his door in New York. In 1970, Bill Reedon consolidates his business into one location at 200 Hamilton Avenue in Palo Alto, and a former employee of John Howell Books, Jeremy Norman, takes over 442 Post Street. I do owe an apology to Erwin Rosenthal, Roy Vernon Sowers, Joseph Rubenstein, and Franklin Gillum, fine booksellers who they all have something in common. They worked in the Bay Area as antiquarian booksellers at various stages in their careers, but their businesses were established elsewhere, and all four of them came and went, and I have chosen for that reason not to weave them into this narrative, not that you would have much more time for it anyway, perhaps in the third edition. In 1973, he sees the publication of David McGee's memoirs of his life as an antiquarian bookseller. David McGee dies in 1977. Warren Howell dies in 1984, and within that year, John Howell Books is closed. Bill Reedon speaks to the Roxborough Club in 1988 about book thieves. He says, "Let them hang by the neck." Bill's still got a sense of humor. I think he was serious. In 1989, Holmes closes its San Francisco branch at 22 3rd Street. 5 years later, the Holmes Book Company closes its Oakland store, its final location. Holmes just barely reaches 100 years old, the longest surviving antiquarian book firm in the San Francisco Bay Area, but it goes no further. There are 3 booksellers active today who got their beginning at Holmes. Michael Good, who's here with us. He also worked at John Howell Books. Tom Goldwasser and David Park, and Robert Hawley, who was at Holmes, then went on to run the Ross Valley Book Company in Albany. In 1991, Bill Reedon closes the Palo Alto store in Hamilton, and in 1995, Bill Reedon dies. When I began frequenting antiquarian bookshops in Northern California in the middle 1970s, I always listened in on the gossip and the talk in the shops. That was one of the ways I learned. And I remember regularly hearing something that I didn't understand. I heard people saying that, lamenting that there weren't as many bookshops as there used to be, that bookstores were closing. To me, the novice, the Bay Area was a cornucopia of bookshops. I went to as many as 4 or 5 during my lunch breaks, and on Saturdays I would sometimes spend the entire day in bookshops. It took me years to realize it, but those perceptive voices that I heard in those bookshops in the late 1970s were correct. And now we know that there's no question about it. San Francisco may have had too many bookshops in 1900. That's not a problem today. I'm going to close my talk with a place where my idea for it began. In 1984, just after Warren Howell died, and it was obvious that John Howell Books was not going to continue, I, just in my first year of ownership of the Brick Row Bookshop, approached the manager of John Howell Books, Jennifer Larson, with the idea of compiling a record of the many employees who passed through that firm and continued on into the world of books. And this broadside, handsomely designed by Christopher Steinauer, is the result. It was a keepsake for a dinner meeting of the International Association of Bibliophiles hosted by the Roxborough Club at the Palace of Legion of Honor in 1985. And you see at the bottom is, you won't be able to read from there, at the bottom is Paul Elder, then John Howell, and Antoinette, who really officially ran the business for a year, and then David McGee, John Swingle, and then it branches out to all these people who went on into the book trade. This broadside tells a remarkable legacy in the antiquarian book trade. A story I hope I have successfully conveyed this evening is only part of a much larger and more interesting picture. Thank you. Here are a list of bookshops that really didn't get mentioned. Maybe some were just alluded to. But I'm doing a timeline on this, so I'm trying to record all of them. And the list of sources, well, you might never see it. It's several pages. I have some copies of that broadside. If any of you were not at that 1984 dinner, well, some of you were, I'm sure. Bill Barlow was there. I got about 60 copies of it. So I'd love to. George Fox and John Windle are going to help distribute these, one per couple. And if you got one before, if you already have one, please don't take another one. We might be able to get one to everybody. They're right here. There are 2 states. There's one on brown paper and one on white paper. The one on brown paper is by far the scarcer of the 2. So, any questions? John? Yes?
When was working in my story?
Answer the list of...
When did it become a distinguishing term?
Like, well, the business directories, I noticed, they just had booksellers. And they'd always say booksellers. And then occasionally a bookseller would distinguish himself by saying secondhand or antiquarian. Well, yeah, well, he called himself an antiquarian. But then it really wasn't until the 1940s that the business directories had separate sections for secondhand. And I think the yellow pages were started doing that, forced the business directories to do it.
And then, of course, the arrival of the association.
Right, but then they had their own app. So, yeah, but no, they didn't. And it really is. The demarcation is complicated as you come down. Anyone else? Tom?
Are you going to in the next edition, are you going to pick up on the antiquarian departments at the department stores?
Well, that's interesting, but it's really hard to find any information.
The White House and Emporium.
White House and Emporium. I think John Scapazzi worked at the Emporium book department before he went to Newbiggins.
And at Books Inc., I think.
There's an oral history with John Scapazzi at Columbia University. That they said, well, if you want it, you have to come here and look at it. And I'm going to go in January and look at that and see what he said about working at the Emporium. Yes, no, that's no. And they really kind of hurt booksellers, individual booksellers, because the department stores, kind of like the Amazons, got into the business of selling everything. Yeah. Wait?
John, you gave the impression that a lot of the earlier sellers were also publishers. Is that generally true, that the early booksellers were also publishers?
No, I'm not sure what the percentage is, but it's not 50%, I don't think. Maybe it's because I was talking about the most prominent ones. But no, a lot of these booksellers were not publishers.
But it's always a temptation to publish. Peter B. Howard published.
Right. Stephen?
Yeah, do you know when new bookstores and used became separate?
Well, some of them were separate originally, but it's not. There were booksellers who only sold new books 150 years ago.
John, when did Henry Evans leave Cohen Street?
I don't know.
Because I kind of remember him there when I joined with my dad about 60 months.
I don't know when he closed up.
And moved to Salon.
No.
I saw the name Graham Hardy fly by very quickly.
Right.
He was in Carson City, I believe, but was he in the Bay Area?
Yes, he was in San Francisco for a while, briefly. Yeah.
Can we get a quick show of hands of people who would absolutely have to have one of these? All right, we're in trouble. Judge? No. Want me to come and take a couple of these?
Thank you. Is there any other?
Let me give these to Judge.
I probably kept you. Oh, I don't know what time it is, but we're probably.
Judge, you do that side of the room.
That's something to do.
Here. I'll take George. Wonder over here.
Thank you very much.